Okay, the first chapter of Project 22AB. Now, to those who are new to this, I'm just going to give you a basic rundown. This story, or book, whatever you want to call it, a documentary, whatever you want to say, was inspired by a book called All Tomorrows, written by C.M. Koseman. I think I said that name right. Anyways, this will not have a whole bunch of like genetic manipulation and crap like that happen in All Tomorrows, but it will have a somewhat similar tone to it, along the lines of empires growing and shit like that. Besides that, this book's gonna be very cohesive. Nothing too crazy. This is gonna be the first segment. This is gonna be chapter one. There will be multiple segments with many more chapters. It's gonna be divided in. So with all further ado being said, we're gonna get started. All right. With the birth of a universe, there is a 1 in 60 billion chance that a world could be inhabitable for humans, an even slimmer chance that humans would naturally form on these planets in question. But against all odds, and with a few controlled variables, the world did house a human race, one that was divided, both politically, geographically, and much more. The only anomaly is that these humans weren't fully native to the world. While yes, there were chimpanzee species that showed examples of complex thought, and given the time they would have evolved into a form of uh, human. However, these present humans had been placed here by another force. They were simply sort of landed here. They were placed here by humans. These mother planets shipped massive colonies of their people, most extremely young, and expected to grow on their own. There were a few adults to take care and nurture these young humans, and these said adults were forbidden to speak anything of these so-called mother planets. So these primordial humans grew up in natural environments with no modern comforts, but were assigned by semi-frequent food drops, but as they grew, they were left on their own. Most began to band together, forming tribes. All these tribes started off as nomadic, traveling and following where the food goes. But as most civilizations did, one human had decided to shove some wheat into the ground, and out came some grain. The discovery exploded around the world, and many nomadic tribes either established themselves as nations or blended in with larger groups, losing their identity in the process. Despite the seemingly annihilation of a nomadic lifestyle, there were still massive nomadic tribes and groups that would harass the major civilizations, even bringing some to the brink of collapse. Many civilizations sprung up after the so-called Wheat Revolution, after a series of established merchants, spread the knowledge of farming. Multiple cultures were kept there, both for transportation and battle. So, this is where we're going to start talking about the sort of cradle of civilization that would give birth to many other empires. This one, for example, is on the continent of something called Eurovig. It's one of the few continents that exists in this world, and this region in Eurovig is called Bratislava. The Bratislava region in southern Eurovig was considered the birthplace of Eurovigic civilization. However, by the year 600 pre-contact, it was essentially abandoned due to the massive earthquakes and mountains that suddenly split in two. These early people settled to many locations. Some went north and turned eastward, settling in Ladoka. This is where we're going to start talking about our first civilization, or many civilizations. These people were called the Yefiks, and embraced cavalry and quick warfare, even though some of these city-states and smaller empires preferred to utilize shock infantry. Ladoka was cold, and some would describe it as gray, but the Yefiks loved it. They flourished in the fall-like weather, and their brief stints of warmth that generated massive crop yields. Their cultures resembled that of what you readers, or listeners, would describe as Eastern European, though they had small similarities to Nordic culture, primarily in architecture and typical looks. Their use of horses put the Yefik city-states ahead of many other civilizations, but they rarely attacked outside of the Ladoka region. Instead, many of these early wars were against each other. Their horses were equipped with light armor, while their rider had an armored chestplate consisting of either leather, steel, or rather rare metals, which were reserved for the finest warriors. These so-called colics would have 3 to 4 weapons out on their persons. 2 spears, the first was called the Bervik, a spear used against common infantry, and lightly armored archerymen. We'll get to those later. These Berwick spears had a metal tip that was about 7 feet long and extremely wobbly, something similar to what the winged hussars would use. The colics would crash against light infantry formations, causing the splints to fracture and hit other enemy soldiers like shrapnel. While earlier wooden models did light damage, variants would have gunpowder filled in the center that would be ignited when thrown by the colic user. This variant would come many years in the future, sort of like the gunpowder revolution. There would also be metal bits in the center, causing an artillery-like explosion that was capable of even killing the rider himself. So it was reserved for skilled horsemen. The second spear contained a sharper point, sturdier word, and it was 7.5 feet long. It was used for armor targets. It is sort of like your armor-piercing spear, i.e., other horsemen. This was to fight these guys. Variants would reinforce for the spear to stabilize it. Other than that, there was no other serious modification besides adding a flag, typically a sign at the end of it, and it was signed to like sort of something of a flag standard. Keep these guys aligned and aligned together. These flag bearers were typically a sergeantus and led the charges. Their third weapon was a 5-foot saber. This thing, it was crazy. The blade started off straight enough, but after about 2 feet, it began a slight curve, leading to a nasty slash effect to enemy fighters, lest their armor be thick enough. This weapon was also primarily reserved for infantry, but we'll get to those guys in a minute. The fourth and final weapon was a shield that was 3 feet tall and 3 feet wide with a metal point at the center. Nothing too important. Yefik infantry were typically skilled swordsmen, and for that they were lightly armored to improve agility. Some units were armored and carried 10-foot poles to counteract the horsemen. These units were on the flanks to protect archers and the swordsmen. Archers were a considerable part of the average Yefik army, and of course they were lightly armored, featuring a metal helmet, and that the swordsman wore, something that the swordsman also wore. A unique group of archers called the Berwick, like I said, but were smaller, and they used a Berwick, but they were smaller units, and they threw it like a spear instead of crashing into enemy soldiers. This is the same wobbly pole that the colics would use for infantry, but these guys threw it. The pole was sturdier, and it was more like a javelin. Then there was a supply corps consisting of civilians and slaves with a small detail of swordsmen to keep it guard. Civilian life in the Yefik society was slightly easier. Their money was called the Wildred. It was gold coin standard. It was a pretty decent thing. Most of it was silver and gold, primarily silver because that's one of the biggest resources in the Lakogan area. The maximum... Oh, nothing. Read that wrong. Farmhands, mostly, which is a large part of their society, grew potatoes, wheat, barley, and a highly coveted corn. The finest farmers that lived in certain areas of Lakoga, more tropical, more lighter up, not tropical, just warmer and typical, had melons. Now, this is where things get hilarious. These melons were highly coveted among the Yefiks, so the finest farmers grew them. Typically, dynasties held these lands. If you neglected your melon harvest, you were almost vilified and outcast society, mostly from the noble class, due to how rare and delighted these fruits were to the Yefik people and primarily nobility. We cannot tell what type of melon they were. They could have been cantaloupe, watermelon, many kinds, but nobody can tell what it is. They're kind of leaning towards cantaloupe. Cantalek, that's what they called them there. Crazy things. Many key merchants and land barons were casted from glory by sabotaging melons. Hilarious stuff. In modern times, this is viewed comically, and thankfully, with the start of global trade, melons became frequently available. An often laughing point to these modern societies is calling Ladokans, or later they would be called Viernans, melon heads. Very, very funny. Average day people in Ladoka worked in shops, were ironsmiths, and created pottery. Others were scholars. Some were religious men. Sacrifices were illegal, and groups who committed such acts were hunted down and annihilated by policing forces that became more and more common amongst Yefik societies. These guys were called the Slits. Not the Slits. That's another group. These guys were called the Yesvarans. This is, hold up, trying to find that again. Others were lawyers, judges, and as mentioned, many were lawmen. Nobles were commonly chosen from wise warriors, those who had proven themselves in combat and in learning rooms. This is for obvious reasons. Nobles led armies with their kings of the city-states that they lived in the Ladoka region. Children of nobles lived more comfortable lives, but were expected to conduct most of their daily lives amongst the average people. This created a more humble upper class, one of which was sympathetic to the average person. Many of the Yefik people were illiterate and skilled in their particular trade. They were mostly just tradesmen, couldn't read, basic stuff. Going onward, some of they couldn't read entirely, but compare that to like a nobleman, they were a little bit dumber, which is to be expected. They're poorer. Okay, now we're going to get on to the unification of Lakogda. God, I can't say that name right. So the entire Lakogda landmass is 11.731 million miles squared. Squared miles, however you want to say that. Fuck you to you math nerds, I don't care. And it was initially split into multiple different city-states. A lot of basic skirmishing warriors, big Kulik armies of horsemen would just crash against each other. You got your infantrymen, different groups like that. Crazy stuff. And modern tactics tactics in general, weren't really considered a thing. They just get a whole bunch of soldiers, throw them at the other guy, and pray that worked. Well, we're going to see here with this prince, soon to be king, he would develop a tactic that would initially fail, but work, and would begin to slowly take over Lakogda. So here we go. With the multiple city-states of Lakogda, there was fractured waves of groups that often fought with each other. Armies rose and fell among the cold grounds of Lakogda, but the status quo would change. In 430 PC, pre-contact, a king named Segretsky II emerged as the unrivaled leader of Eresvia, a city-state on the Lakogda-Yuravig border. His father, Segretsky, was poisoned by rival city merchants when a trade deal with coal and iron went sour. Seeking revenge, Segretsky II raised a massive army of 50,000, 20,000 consisting of Colic cavalrymen, 10,000 archers, and Bervik swordsmen. Okay, got this. That's about 30,000, and 20,000 simple swordsmen. I think I forgot to say that the swordsmen also had the same shield that the Colics would use, and the same 5-foot saber-like sword. So 50,000 and marched on the city of Leah. Yeah, that's right. A very simple sounding name. Nothing like Gudurisa. They were promptly routed at the Battle of Lake Kras and retreated back to Erevesia. Segretsky modernized Colic tactics, sending them to the back of the swordsmen behind the big swordsmen-like legions, and arming the swordsmen with large shields. The swordsmen would advance towards the rival army, lock shields, and the cavalry would zoom outward behind them and attack the horde of enemy troops and retreat behind the swordsmen so they couldn't get pinned down. The swordsmen would then advance, repeating the process till they were upon the enemy. From there, archers and their counterparts would open fire point blank. This tactic would later be revised, where they would try to keep the archers and missile throwers, missile with heavy quotations. These weren't actual rockets. Again, these were the Berviks, were light spears. They would try to keep them back, where they could sort of shower the enemy with arrows until the swordsmen were able to get them. Now, when the swordsmen got closer, the archers and missile throwers would cease fire because they ran the risk of hitting their own guys. So where was I? Hold on. After the barrage, swordsmen and cavalry would swarm towards and annihilate the remaining troops, aiming for their commander or king, which was typical in these types of battles. Killing the commander would typically rout the army, until, again, more modern tactics where infantry would start getting officers, the Korasnia, or the captain, the Sargenta, which was sort of like that platoon level commander, just basic stuff. So Segretsky tried using these tactics on Leah. The plan worked somewhat. Instead of the swordsmen advanced, but they actually pinned the enemy's armies down. They actually held down the infantry, while the cavalry then swooped behind the enemy, sort of making like a crane swinging by and closing its wings and encircling the enemy. The infantry had essentially held the enemy down. The cavalry swarmed it, and it was a slaughter. Now, there were a few that were able to turn tail and run, but most were just killed. Some were able to surrender, thankfully, but overall, it was a complete rout. This occurred over and over and over with other city-states as Segretsky began to expand. Their kings either submitted to Segretsky or were killed. Now, Segretsky killed and slaughtered his way across Lakogda. He has a bit of a controversial standing with modern Vienna, which is currently inhabiting Lakogda. That's the modern civilization. Now, conquering it within 5 years, his lineage became the de facto ruling group, the Segretsky line. This would be temporarily, the empire was called Yefia. Now, Yefia, or the Empire of Yefia, would remain in power and remain the de facto empire of Lakogda until the contact. We will talk about that more, but essentially after that, they are almost annihilated. The entire Segretsky line is killed, and it would be under a sort of occupation, which is a little bit of a different standing because many other civilizations during the contact had a very peaceful transaction, not Lakogda, and this would sort of shape their history, their sort of viewing on the outside world. So anyways, Lakogda is now ruled by the Yefia, or the Yefig Empire. The people are called the Yephites. Something boring. They established contact with nations, beginning a new age in Eurovig, Lakogda, or Euroviga. This essentially combined that, sort of like how Russia's connected to Europe, it kind of likes to keep itself away from it. Lakogda or Yefia, whatever you want to say, would kind of do this too. But for now, they were connected. This empire will last for hundreds of years until the contact. And we will finish that off. Chapter 1 is done. We will be talking next time about the Hausans in the rest of Europe. So, Lakogda, currently the largest landmass inhabited by humans in the world so far. There were mass regions in Lakogda or Yefia at the time that were not inhabited, mostly just the remnants of nomads living there, horsemen mostly. And that's just what's going on. Now, Eurovig is 12 million miles squared total, and there are about 3 nations, major civilizations that would form there in the future. So to give you guys a bit of a perceptible timeline to expect from Yefia or Lakogda, it would go from the Yephite Empire to occupation. A rebellion would occur in later centuries. The current 2 leaders, well 3 if you want to count, their sort of puppet king, or not king, but president, would then go on to form the nation of Vienna, or the People's Republic of Vienna. Now, I know what you're thinking, holy crap, they're communists. They're not. Completely opposite thing. They eventually adopted something of a capitalistic, slightly socialist economy where a lot of government works were controlled by the government, like state parks, but they were overall capitalistic. So again, to restate this, to go from Yephite, occupation, rebellion, Vienna. That is that right now. But right now, in this chapter of Section 1, pre-contact, you have the Yephite Empire. Something a little bit interesting is they write a lot of tales, and maybe at some point by the end of this segment, we'll go over a lot of the tales of this world, particularly in Lakogda or Yefia. A Q&A will be done at the end of this chapter once we've gone through all the nations and semi-nations. And yeah, that begins the project of 22AB. I hope you guys enjoy that. Leave a comment, like, share. I really encourage you to tell your friends if you like this. It's something I really want to grow. And it's a sort of fan base that I like. It's something of an alternate world of Earth while somewhat similar. And I think it's something that could be really important. It features a lot of combinations from media, history, games maybe if you want to talk about that. I know for the Viernans, their intelligence group is based off the name of a very popular Slavic game called Soccer, and their intelligence group is called Common Consciousness. Again, like, share, tell all your buddies, or tell the story of the Yephites. We will release the next chapter of the Hausans next Monday. Or Sunday, who knows? It's a mystery. Life's a mystery. I'll be sure to tell you guys. Alright, so have a good day.